December 2025 feels like a hinge. The air itself seems charged, as if stories we've been telling ourselves about the future are beginning to split open and reveal a different shape beneath. Headlines move faster. Weather patterns behave like actors who've forgotten their cues. People wake with a nameless urgency in their chests, a sense that something is coming that will rearrange more than just maps and markets. Long before satellites and social feeds, one man, the sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce, claimed he could access an archive of potential futures. He offered readings that later readers point to as uncanny, passages interpreted to touch the 1929 market convulsions, hints that many connect to the causes and consequences of global conflict in the 1940s, and references that some have linked to the discovery of ancient scrolls in the Dead Sea region. Whether you take him as mystic, healer, or curious historical figure, Cayce's portfolio of predictions has enough striking hits that when he named a year as pivotal, people listened. According to Cayce's readings, that year is 2026. He framed it not as a single headline event, but as an inflection, a season in which geological, geopolitical, and spiritual currents intersect. The claim is not offered here as scientific fact, but as a probability map, a lens through which to imagine what might shift and how people might respond. The question before us is simple and urgent. Edgar Cayce predicted 2026, and here's what will happen next, if we read his map as a warning, a guide, and perhaps an invitation. Cayce's vision unfolds through three recurring principles that act like lenses on that map. The first, the Earth is treated as a living, responsive being. In his readings, the planet is not a static stage, but a participant that can respond to mental states, collective choices, and long-simmering stresses. This language is metaphorical and spiritual, yet it translates into very practical images. Coasts reshaped, land rising and falling, water reclaiming what was once firm. The second principle is national karma, the idea that nations, like individuals, carry accumulated patterns, decisions, actions, priorities, that bear consequences over time. Cayce spoke of nations answering for choices that shaped their identity, whether they pursued exploitation or stewardship, whether they favored compassion over conquest. This is not a legal judgment, but a thematic reading. Consequences have a pattern. The third lens is a return of older soul patterns, what Cayce and his followers often describe with terms like Atlantean influence, and a test of technological maturity. In his framework, humanity's increasing technological power is not morally neutral. It amplifies underlying choices. These three ideas, Earth as living being, national karma, and the test of returning soul patterns, combine to create a map where certain regions are shown in high probability for upheaval, and others emerge as centers of renewal. Let's move through that map, region by region, always remembering this is Cayce's probability overlay, not a scientific forecast. Treat the colors on this imagined map as questions, not certainties. On the West Coast, Cayce's readings suggest rupture and breakdown in the familiar forms. He spoke of upheaval along western shores, an interplay of earthquakes, volcanic activity, and sudden shifts that could unmake coastlines people have taken for granted. Picture cliffs that once looked permanent, loosening their hold, entire neighborhoods that have lived with the hum of tectonics for generations, suddenly learning what sudden means. The reading's imagery is dramatic. Infrastructure that cannot withstand a new tempo of motion, communities forced to negotiate with an altered seashore. This is not a prescription of imminent doom, it is a probability scenario. Coastal communities are not uniform threats. Some areas may adapt, others may be forced into retreat. Cayce's point is both geophysical and symbolic. The western edge of a nation might be called to reckon with choices about stewardship, development, and the human-made landscape imposed on dynamic Earth. The lesson is less flee now than pay attention and plan with humility. On the other side of the continent, Cayce's readings draw a different but equally stark picture for the East Coast, particularly around major urban centers like New York. He described rapid shoreline change, places that had been icons of stability finding their margins altered in short order. The image is not only of water advancing slowly over decades. In his view, there are scenarios where the coastline's geometry shifts quickly, swallowing familiar edges and changing the relationship between city and sea. For cities that sit at those edges, the readings suggest a moment of reckoning. Industries, transportation, and social networks that depended on historical coastlines would need to adapt or be remade. Northern Europe shows up on Cayce's overlay as a region of dramatic redrawing. He spoke of lands lifting and falling, of coasts redrawn, and communities dislocated. The language used in the readings is evocative, a continent that has been shaped by eons of glacial and marine forces, experiencing new chapters in its topography. This is not offered as a deterministic fate list, but as a picture of probabilities, places to watch, communities to support, and political bodies to consider in their planning. Then there are the polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctic, where Cayce's readings point to disturbances that touch oceans and crustal stability. In his account, the poles act like great hinges. Shifts there have outsized ripple effects. Again, the reading's framing is probabilistic. Disturbances in those latitudes could influence ocean currents, sea levels, and broader climate rhythms in ways that rearrange coastlines and ecosystems. In Cayce's narrative, these shifts are part geophysical and part symbolic. An invitation to reconsider our relationship to planetary systems we long presumed steady. Against these red zones, the readings also place surprising green areas, regions that might become centers for reordering and renewal. Interior North America, the American Midwest, and parts of southern Canada appears in the readings as a place of stability and eventual replenishment. It's described as land that could support rebuilding, agriculture, and community transformation as coasts and edges go through their changes. Russia, too, appears in certain readings as a region that could become influential in the redistribution of population and resources, although the specifics are couched in Cayce's language of probabilities and karmic patterning rather than geopolitical prescriptions. The map that emerges from Cayce's readings is not merely a chart of movement. It is a moral and psychic diagnostic. Why do these places appear? In his framework, it's a mixture of physical susceptibility and the accumulated decisions of nations and peoples, choices about consumption, stewardship, technology, and how we treat one another. Numbers on a hazard map do not tell the whole story. Cayce repeatedly connects geography to inner state. That brings us to what he said about protection, not of walls and bunkers, but of frequency. Cayce did not hand out survival checklists. He did not emphasize hoarding or panic. Instead, he returned again and again to the notion that inner alignment, what he and his followers called frequency, shifts how events touch a life. Frequency is described as a combination of compassion, service, inner peace, and clarity of purpose. In his readings, people acting out of fear and isolation perpetuate timelines marked by loss and scarcity. Those aligning with compassion, service, and communal care tend toward timelines marked by resilience and rebirth. This is not a promise that individual virtue guarantees physical safety. It is an interpretive claim. Inner state influences collective decisions and the social bonds that shape responses to crises. A community bound by mutual aid, trust, and cooperation is likely to weather disruptions differently than one fractured by fear. In Cayce's language, spiritual preparedness is not an abstract piety, but a practical orientation toward others that rewrites likely outcomes. Imagine two towns facing the same shoreline change. In the first, panic-driven messaging fractures trust. Resources concentrate in private hands. Neighbors close ranks around separate stockpiles. In the second, people mobilize around shared resources, rotate responsibilities, and integrate newcomers into communal plans. Both towns face the same material challenge, but their outcomes diverge not only because of infrastructure, but because of relational frequency. Cayce's point is that the quality of our collective attention and care can bend probabilities. This spiritual solution has practical corollaries. Cayce's readings encourage community building, networks of mutual aid, local food systems, shared skills and knowledge, and governance that centers cooperation over competition. These are not survivalist recipes. They are civic practices that, whether or not you accept the metaphysical claims, reduce vulnerability. They encourage humility in the face of systems beyond our control and agency in the relationships we can cultivate. Cayce also wove into his picture an ethical test tied to technology. He suggested that our tools, nuclear and electrical power, information systems, increasingly autonomous machines, amplify whatever we embody as a culture. Power without wisdom magnifies harm. Power guided by compassion magnifies care. In his readings, the year 2026 surfaces as a barometer. Will technological capacity be governed by collective wisdom or by narrow, self-interested gain? That question is not scientific prediction. It is moral interrogation posed through the probability lens. Midway through this map, a surprising insight emerges. Safety is rarely a single zip code. The so-called safe zones named in Cayce's readings, interior North America, parts of Canada, and certain northern regions, are places of potential physical stability. But Cayce's deeper emphasis is that geographic location alone does not guarantee flourishing. A person in a green zone living in isolation and fear might fare worse than someone in a red zone who has woven resilient social bonds. The reading's currency is relational. This brings us to choices. Cayce's scenario building ultimately presents two timelines, one defined by fear and fragmentation, and another that might be called the New Earth timeline. The fear timeline amplifies insecurity, protective hoarding, divisive politics, and militarized responses that make cooperation harder. Infrastructure may be fortified in narrow ways, but social capital erodes. Stress feeds stress, and the map becomes redder. The New Earth timeline asks for a different posture. It asks for broadening circles of care, for shared skills, and for reorganizing economies around local resilience and equitable distribution. It asks, above all, for a shift in frequency, from scarcity-driven competitiveness to abundance-minded cooperation. In Cayce's terms, this is not naive optimism. It's pragmatic spiritual practice. If inner orientation shapes collective choices, then cultivating compassion and service is a strategic act. How might that look in lived practice without descending into prescription? It can look like neighbors learning to garden together and sharing harvests rather than stockpiles. It can look like local governance that prioritizes infrastructure upgrades where they protect the most vulnerable. It can mean institutions investing in systems that bind communities rather than extract from them. None of these actions promise immunity, but together they create patterns of resilience that alter probability. There's another ethical dimension in Cayce's overlay: accountability. National karma, as he framed it, means that policies and cultural directions have long-term ripple effects. Practices that externalize harm, pollution, dispossession, reflexive exploitation of resources, tend to produce conditions where probability maps show greater exposure. Practices that internalize stewardship reduce those exposures. Again, this is not prophecy as legalism, but as a pattern recognition. Choices have consequences, and systems have moral valence. As we approach the climax of Cayce's picture, this cusp of 2026, the narrative tightens around agency. We are not passive victims of prophecy, nor are we guaranteed architects of utopia. Cayce's readings offer probabilities and an ethics. The more a people aligns their inner frequency with compassion and service, the more their probabilities bend toward renewal. This leaves us with practical, non-alarmist movements to consider. First, cultivate community ties. Relationships are the most portable resource we have. They convert housing into homes, strangers into mutual aid, and isolated goods into shared wealth. Second, learn transferable skills. Food production, basic repair, first response. Skills that multiply when shared. Third, invest time in civic engagement, advocate for planning that reflects long-range prudence, and support policies that strengthen social safety nets. None of these steps are panaceas, but together they create adaptive networks. And while we do these, remember the inner work. Cayce's recurring instruction is deceptively simple. Align with compassion and service. Practice the discipline of attention. How do you respond under stress? Do you withdraw into fear or extend help? This inner posture is not mystical magic that bends geology. It is the psychological and social engine that determines how communities deploy resources when tides change and when systems fail. Before we close, one more layer. The symbolic role of ancient patterns in Cayce's view. References to Atlantean influence and to records, such as those some call the Hall of Records, appear in the readings as elements of a larger soul history, markers of the human story that recur in cycles. These claims are metaphysical and speculative by their nature, and in Cayce's method they serve as reminders. Humanity carries long memories that surface in crises, and the choices we make now reverberate into future legacies. So what will happen next? According to Cayce's readings, 2026 is a year of intensified probability. Regions will be tested, old structures will yield, and new centers of life may emerge. But the readings do not decree a single outcome. They offer a map that responds to human agency. If we choose panic and isolation, the map darkens. If we choose to cultivate frequency, care, community, and wise technological stewardship, the map brightens. Cayce's message is not simply meteorological, it is ethical. If this message hits you with a kind of clarity, if you feel the urge to move from anxious watching to deliberate building, there is one symbolic thing we can do together right now. If you are willing, write in the comments, "I'm ready for the new earth." Let that pledge be less a promise of personal safety and more a commitment to practice. Let it signal your intention to turn inward panic into outward care, to bind with neighbors, and to invest your skills in common good. We will be returning to this series. In the next installment, we will examine Cayce's connections to ancient sites, including Giza, and explore the question he raised about records of past ages and what they might tell us about our present turning. If you want to follow that exploration, subscribing will make sure you don't miss it. Edgar Cayce predicted 2026 not as a calendar date that closes the book, but as an invitation to choose how we meet what's coming. The map he left is ambiguous because it reflects choices we have yet to make. We face a moment that asks for courage, not panic, for generosity, not hoarding, for wisdom, not blind force. If you feel that nudge in your chest, a readiness to show up differently, let that be the first movement toward a new pattern. Comment, "I'm ready for the new earth," if you intend to practice that readiness. Share this with someone who feels the change in the air. And join us as we follow Cayce's map into the next chapter, where ancient questions and modern technologies meet at the edge of 2026.